what is the subclass and the superclass. Okay, if you remember, we said that we can have an entity. When you have an entity, you can divide that entity into subgroups or many groups. It depends of the requirement, and you will have that entity might be grouped into, for instance, for our example, an employee can be divided into group of secretary, group of engineer, group of technician, based on what this group subgrouping it is based on. For instance, it might be based on the employee's job. We might also divide or create another group from employee, which we call manager, which contains all the employees who are managers within your database. And at this moment, we say that we have created that manager subgroup based on the role they play within the entity employee. We might also have another two subgroups, salaried employee and hourly employee, which is based on the employee's method of pay. Okay, and we said this is the way how we can represent them. We do have our entity employee and those different type subgroups. These are all the subgroups that can be divided or that can be extracted, and they will contain, okay, people or employee based on whether we are talking about jobs, based on the role they play, or based on the method of pay they are paid. Okay, this is what we said with regard to these subgroups. And we said that this subgrouping, it is a subset of the employee. And we looked at how we do have, as we mentioned, we do have employee set, and we are going to take some of those employee. They will be put in secretary, for instance, based on their jobs. Okay, and here we said that this secretary is a subset of the employee. Technician is a subset of employee, and so on. Also, we said that this employee is called a superclass. Okay, sorry. This is a superclass, and these are the subclass. And we do have here the subgrouping. We do have a subclass of employee. We do have employee superclass, and we do have this relationship between a superclass and the subclass. We do have employee secretary, employee technician, employee manager. So this is the type of the superclass subclass relationship. We said also we can have another representation which is called as a relationship. We say that secretary is an employee, technician is an employee. So this is another way to specify the relationship, whether this in this manner based on superclass subclass, or we can use the is a. Okay, it is the same thing. We said that an entity that is a member of subclass represents something from the real world as its superclass. Okay, we cannot have a subclass entity without having a superclass. They don't exist. We cannot have a secretary subclass without having employee superclass. So because it is a subclass, that means it is taken from something else, from parent, from superclass. So the superclass must exist before we can create those subgroups or subclasses. When we mentioned that, we explained that. We said also it is not necessary that every entity in a superclass be a member of some subclasses. Okay, not necessarily all the employees, okay, here must be one of those subgroups or belongs to some of those subgroups. Okay, it is not necessarily. We might have an employee who is not a secretary, who is not technician, who is not engineer, who is not manager. Okay, we don't care about what he is, but not necessarily. Okay, it depends of your requirement and your EER diagram you are going to create. Okay, now another important thing with regard to the relationship of superclass subclass, we say that an entity that is a member of a subclass inherits. ايش معنى inherits يا شباب؟
يعني
تارث. Okay, it will take all what it will. If you remember, an entity is defined by what? When we talk about an entity is defined by its attributes and its relationship. Okay, if you remember when we looked at the ER diagram, we did have entity. Okay, we did have entity, and those entity have their attributes, and they do have a relationship that they are participating on. For instance, for employee, we did have employee has a relationship with the project, works on project, works for department. So this is relationship. So that means any entity that you do have in your ER diagram, EER, that means it does have some types of relationship that it participates on, and it does have its attribute. So as part of inheritance, any subclass of a superclass will inherit all the attributes of the parent of the superclass, and it inherits also all the relationships where the attribute employee is participating on. What does that mean? And as secretary, as we said, secretary is a subset of employee. It is an employee. If an employee in the entity employee has name, وعنده birthday, to address, SSN, whatever the attribute, معناه also a secretary will have the same attribute, because it is an employee. Before being secretary, it is an employee. He is an employee. Before being a technician, before being categorized as a technician, he is an employee, and because he is an employee, he will also have the same attribute as employee. It doesn't mean that when he is a technician, he will not have the same attribute as employee. No, because it is a subset, it has been taken from employee. Any attribute that we gave for employee will be the same for the technician. Any relationship where an employee works or participate, the same thing for the subset will inherit that relationship. We say an employee, for instance, works for project. We do have also technician works for project. Okay, it will inherit that relationship. So this is what we mean by inheritance between the subset and superclass. An entity that is a member of a subclass inherits all the attributes of an entity as a member of the superclass, because he's a member of superclass, and all relationships of the entity as member of the superclass. So it will inherit all the attribute and all the relationships. Okay, as we mentioned here in the slide, secretary as well as technician engineer inherits the attributes name, SSN, and same thing. Okay, we looked at the specialization. We said that specialization is the way of defining the set of subclasses of a superclass. If you remember, we said that we do have here an employee, okay, and from that employee we define 3 subclasses: secretary, technician, engineer. And because they are belongs to the same set, here we talk about, we call them as specialization. Okay, you do have, for instance, example here: secretary, engineer, technician. This is a set, مجموعة, and these are the elements. Secretary, engineer, technician are elements of the set, this set, and this one is called the specialization of employee. And we created this specialization based on what? Based on the job type. Okay, based on the job type, we created from employee, we created 3 subgroups, well as 3 subsets: secretary, technician, engineer. These 3 altogether, because they have been taken or created based on the same criteria, which is the job type, we call this set as specialization. We do have another specialization, okay, which is, if you see it, we do have another specialization, manager. It is on its own. Okay, it is the only subclass that is directly related to the employee. So this is not a specialization. And if you remember what we said about that circle, we said that when you create or when you link some subset to the same circle, that means these subsets belongs to the same specialization. They belongs to the same subset. They are based, sorry, they belongs to the same set. Okay, and all those subclasses or subset are related by a line to the circle. Then the circle itself is related to the parent, to the superclass. And this is the way how we can show a specialization. Okay, we link all the element of specialization to the same circle, then the circle itself is linked to the parent or to the superclass. Okay, we said that because secretary is a subset of employee, technician is a subset of employee, engineer is a subset of employee, we do have this symbol which remains, which is the subset, which shows the superclass and the subclass relationship. That means this one is a subset of employee. We do have this symbol, inclusion. If you remember in maths, Shabab, do you remember this symbol?
Yeah.
Okay, so we do have secretary is included in employee. That means this secretary is a subset of employee. Technician is a subset of employee. Engineer is a subset of employee. Okay, Shabab. So this is for the specialization, and we said we might have many specialization on the same superclass, like this example. Okay, we do have many specialization. We do have this specialization, the secretary, technician, engineer. We do have another specialization, manager. We do have another specialization, salaried employee and hourly employee. They both are linked to the same circle. Mana, they belong to the same set, and they form another specialization, which is this one. And we said specialization, it is a set, so we have to put this curly bracket, okay, to show that this is a set. Okay, Shabab? And all are taken from employee. If you can see here, this one is taken from employee, this one is from employee, and this one is from employee as well. Okay, Shabab? So this is for the specialization. This is how we can represent specialization. We said that we do have another specialization with the salaried employee, hourly employee. Attribute now. Okay.
Doctor, just to make sure,
now
is the semicircle signifies a superclass to a subclass?
the circle,
The semicircle,
this one,
the U shapes, yes.
the subset. Yeah, this is the subset symbol. It shows that the relationship superclass subclass. That this one is a subset of the superclass.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay. Now, if you can see here, for our example, all those subclasses, okay, all these subclasses, technician, engineer, secretary, okay, have their membership based on what here? They are based on what? How did we make
job type?
Barakallah. It is based on the job type. Can you see here? We do have on the job type. Job type secretary, job type technician, job type engineer. That's why we put here the value. This is the attribute. Job type is the attribute, and these are the values of the attribute. Job type equals to engineer. Job type equals to technician. Job type is equals to secretary. Okay, this specialization, we call this specialization attribute defined specialization. Okay, if you create a specialization based on some attribute, okay, we call this specialization, we're talking about specialization, we call it attribute defined specialization. And the attribute that was used to create that specialization is called a defining attribute. Okay, this is a defined attribute specialization. Okay, because we have created that specialization based on that specific attribute. Okay, and we created this attribute that is used to create this specialization is called defined attribute of that specialization. Okay, Shabab? So that means now all the entities with the same value for the attribute, that is for the job, any employee who has job at type equals to secretary will be member of the same subset, secretary. Any employee who is part, who has a job type equals to technician will belong to the same, will be put on the same subset or subclass. Okay, so here that's why we put, okay, here we took for below the arc, we are putting the value of that attribute or defining attribute. Job type, we specify technician, which means all the elements, all the employees who are inside this subclass have their job type attribute equals to technician. Okay, guys? So this is what we mean by, okay, based on what, let's say, those subclasses have been created, okay, which are showing. And sometimes what you can have, sometimes you don't have any condition. If we don't have any condition, it is based on the designer, for instance, we say that we do have a user defined subclass, okay, because it is not based on anything of that say any attribute, okay. It is directly we have created that not on the basis of some attribute or a value of the attribute. It is based on say the designer who has designed that EER diagram without referring to specific attribute. Okay,
Doctor, could you give me example?
Naam.
Could you give me example, please, for this user?
Which one? For the user defined?
Yes.
You can, for instance, create. Let's say here, for instance, without. I will not put here any attribute. Okay, I will not put this job type, will secretary, technician, engineer. I will just, by experience, from my experience, I will look at the employees within my organization, for instance, and I will say, on my experience, anyone who has been who has certified, who has a BSc, who has been graduated and has a BSc certificate or a degree, I will put it as engineer. Okay, without caring about any type of, let's say, the job type. Okay, without giving them any job. But this classification, from my experience, I will base my classification based on let's say the degree or some university or whatever. Okay, and when we put that on, when we represent that in EER, we don't put the attribute. If you see that we don't have any attribute, that means it is user defined. It is based on some criteria. Maybe I will choose another criteria, ages or a combination of some ticks or some experience and so on. Okay.
Okay.
Now we do have something that is related to specialization, which is known as disjointness, and this is the D that you have seen in the circle, inside the circle. Okay, here we say that when you see a D and all those subclasses are related to that circle with D, and D means disjointness. وش معنى disjointness? Do you remember, شباب, in math? Two sets are disjoint. What does that mean?
Separate.
Doctor, they have some common value between them?
لا, the inverse.
That's the opposite. They don't have a common value.
That means disjoint. Can you hear me now, Shabab?
Yes,
Yeah.
now yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
If you do find an employee who belongs to secretary group, he will not be also in a technician group. This is disjoint. معناه element of secretary cannot be found in technician, cannot be found in engineer. If you look at the intersection between this subset and this subset, you will find it an empty set. Okay, this is what we mean by disjointness. Okay, disjointness. We have here, we said that subclasses of the specialization must be disjoint. That means an entity can be a member of at most one of the subclasses of the specialization. Okay, we cannot have, let's say, one element who belongs to a subclass belongs also to another subclass. Okay, at most, that this is the only subclass where we do have that element belonging to. If he is in secretary, he cannot be also in technician or in another subclass. This is what we mean by disjointness. Here we say it is based on the job type. When we specify this is your job is to be a secretary. Okay, that means you cannot have another job at the same time to be technician or to be engineer. Okay, and other thing that this attribute, sometimes we do have some specific attribute for the subclass itself. On top of the subclasses or attributes that are inherited from the superclass, we might have some specific attribute related to the secretary. For the typing speed, for instance, T grade technician, engineer type, for instance, okay? Because we cannot have those attributes in the superclass, because not all employees will be secretary, will a technician and engineer, which needs to have those attributes. So those specific attributes are specific related to the subclass. So if we do have, not necessarily we should have some those attributes, okay? In some circumstances, you do have, for instance, I want to, for secretary, to have an extra attribute which specifies, for instance, the typing speed for that secretary. So you might have that and link that specific attribute to that subclass, which is known by having such attribute. Okay, so this is with regard to the specialization. Now we do have another thing, okay, which is related to known as generalization. Generalization is what? In reality, it is the inverse, or the reverse of the specialization. Okay, what is meant by that? That means you will be given several classes. You will have many classes, and those classes, they will have some common features. Okay, and based on the common features, you will create a generalized superclass, and those subclasses or those classes will belong to will be considered as subclasses or original classes for those subclasses. Okay, so what we will have, let's have a look at this example. Okay, let's have, I gave you a car. Okay, we do have here, is our, yes, okay, let's say we do have a car class, and I do have a truck class. They are separated. This is a class with its attribute, and this is a truck, a class with its attribute. Okay, so these two, okay, can be categorized. They do have something in common. Okay, whether we talk about car or we talk about truck, both can be categorized as what? As a vehicle. صح ولا لا شباب? We do a vehicle of type car, and we do have a vehicle of type truck. So these are separated classes. So we do generalization by what? By creating a superclass. We call it vehicle. Okay, and what we can have also, and those previous classes will be now in my generalization, there will be a subclass of that superclass vehicle. Okay, Shabab? So this is what is known as generalization. Okay, what we see, what I've seen previously, we did have our specialization. We do have specialization. That means we do have the parent, we do have the superclass, and we created some subgroups, and those subgroups are put in some specific set, which we call them specialization. Now we do have the inverse. We don't have the parent, we don't have the superclass. We have only also, so if I didn't give you the employee, I just told you I do have class secretary, I do have technician, I do have engineer, I do have manager. Okay, or let's say just it's three: secretary, technician, engineer. Yes, you will say, and I want you to add to create generalization. You will see something in common between secretary, technician, engineer. They are all employee. Okay, so I will link them to the employee and say now they are not individual classes, but they are considered as subclasses, like we did here. I do have a car class on its own. I do have a truck class on its own, because they share the same common feature, being a vehicle at the same time. So we create the parent with a superclass, and we link those two separated classes. Now they are considered as a subclass. So this is what is known as generalized. We did the reverse. Okay, عملية عكسية. Okay, شباب. Another thing, and here we did with the another thing. We have already talked about predicate. Okay, we talk about the jointness. now with that D, now we do have, if not disjoint, we say that specialization is overlapping. Specialization is overlapping, which means that is the same entity may be member of more than one subclass of the specialization, and we specify, instead of having that D, we specify it by O. Okay, where is our example? Okay, yes. Okay, this is what is known as, we do have O, overlapping. Overlapping means we can have a part, it's like the inverse of the disjointness. Disjointness, we said we cannot have an employee, for our example, or the one that we have seen previously, we said that we cannot have an employee to be a member of more than one subclass. For the O symbol, okay, what we can have, we said that we can have an entity from an employee who might be a member of more than one specific, not jointness, more than specific. We do have here an overlapping. This is an example. You do have, for instance, part. Okay, if I call about a part of, let's say, any part of a machine or a car or whatever. Okay, a part can belongs to a manufactured part, and it can belongs to a purchased part. Okay, there is no problem that a part to be a member of more than one subclass. That's why we do have that O. Okay, we do have that O. That means which is an overlapping. Overlapping means you can have more than one, let's say, element of that superclass belonging to some, let's say, more than one subclass. Okay, Shabab?
We can, for example, here make each one not in same specialization, each one alone, and they connect with part.
Say it again.
I said, Doctor, we can, for example, like what we make in manager, we make it subclass without any specialization. It's a specialization in its own.
Yes.
So we can make them like that without using O. Why we need to?
No, because in the real time, in the real environment, or the real world, okay, a manager, for instance, for the manager, a manager cannot be engineer, or sorry, a manager cannot be if it does have a role, because we divide the specialization based on the role. Okay, this specialization is based on the job type, and this is based on the role type. Okay, and what we do have here, when we do have, for instance, where is our example? Because when you talk about the part, okay, part has these two things. Okay, it is it is specified. You can specify the manufacturer, and you can specify the purchase date. For instance, when we purchase that part. Okay, when you this is the scenario. That's why we say this part, or these two subclasses are overlapping. That means I can find an element here who is also, we can find it also here. For instance, I bought a brake, let's say a Hyundai brake, and here when I go to the purchased part, okay, I will have that Hyundai brake that we have purchased it. Okay, here you do have a list of manufacturers, مثلا Honda, Toyota, all the brakes of many models, and purchased what we have bought. For instance, one of them I bought a Hyundai one. So that Hyundai brake, you can find its name here, and it is also here. That's why we say it is an overlapping. Okay, not that means it's not disjoint. That means we can have a part that is element of more than one subset.
No, it's clear, Doctor.
Okay. Another, what is our example? Okay, another constraint where we do have the completeness or totalness. It's like when we did last time in our ER with our total or partial. When we say, for instance, I do have a total specialization, and every entity in the superclass must be a member of at least one of that subclass. Okay, if we go to our example, an employee, Go to the biggest one. Okay. Here, for instance, for the employee, we said an employee must be either, for instance, can belong here for the employee, as we mentioned, an employee. This is a partial, like we did, if you remember, with the ER, partial and total. صح ولا لا? Do you remember? We said that when you do have a relation partial, that means not necessarily all the employee must be or must belong to one of those subclasses. Not necessarily all the employee can be or must be a manager. But here we do have a total participation. What is meant by that, total participation?
So the employee must either be a salaried employee or an hourly employee. It cannot be something else.
Not in terms of either.
No, all employee
Yes.
can be hourly employee or salaried employee.
All the employee must be hourly employee or salaried employee. We talk about must. And now we cannot find an employee who doesn't belong to hourly employee or to salaried employee. He must be one of them. Here we do have disjoint. Don't forget, you have disjoint. That means an employee must be, the method of payment for his salary, he must receive his salary based on, we call it salaried employee or we call it hourly employee. We must have an employee belonging to one of those two subclasses. However, here for this specialization, this specialization, okay, we do have a partial. معناها not the employee must be a member of manager. No, the employee must be member of secretary or technician or engineer. Okay, clear شباب for this one?
Yeah.
We call it
Yes.
a total specialization. This is a total specialization. And this is a partial specialization because of that link. Okay, because this is specialization that is linked to that circle, which is also linked to the superclass. So this is a partial specialization. This is a partial specialization because of that single line. And this is a total specialization because of this double line. Okay, so this is what we mean by that specialization or the double line or a single line. So here what we can have, because we do have those constraints, we can have in specialization and generalization, we can have disjoint total, we'll have disjoint partial, we can have overlapping total, we can have overlapping partial. These are, let's say, 4 types of specialization and generalization. Okay, and here for the disjoint, we have already mentioned this one, overlapping, yes. And here we said that setter insertion and deletion rule apply to specialization as a consequence of the constraint specified. Okay, these are the rules. What we mean here, deleting an entity from a superclass that is automatically deleted from all the subclasses to which it belongs. If you go to an employee who was categorized as secretary, if we delete, for instance, I do have Omar who is an employee, and his job, okay, type is a secretary. If I delete Omar from employee, do we have Omar still in the secretary, or it should be deleted?
It should be deleted as well.
It should be deleted. Okay, this is what we said. We said we cannot have an entity existing without belonging to subclass, without being belonging to the superclass. And if some employee or some element of the employee entity is deleted from the parent, it should also be deleted from the subclasses. This is one of the rules. Inserting an entity in a superclass implies that the entity is mandatorily inserted in all predicate defined or attribute for which, let's say, that subclass satisfied. Okay, if for instance here we have created these subclasses based on this attribute job type, okay, and I do have an employee who has a job type equals to secretary. I have just added a new employee whose job type is equals to engineer, for instance. that employee, that newly employee or a newly added employee should also be should be added automatically to the engineer, because this engineer subclass contains all the employees who have the job type equals to engineer. And when I add a new element with the same value engineer for the job type attribute, that means it should be in the engineer. It cannot be here alone. It cannot be not added to the engineer. If I added a new employee which has a job type technician, he should be also a member of technician subclass. These are the rules, okay, with the ER. Inserting an entity in a superclass of a total specializations implies that entity is mandatorily inserted also at least one of the subclasses of the specialization. Okay, for instance, the same way, the same analogy, what we did with a total participation. When I add an engineer, okay, someone who is an whose job type is engineer, okay, we said because all those specialization are based on that value of the attribute job type, that means he should be part of one of those. This is for the job type, predicate job type. Now, for the total participation, that newly employee that we have just added, okay, to employee entity, Omar مثلا, okay, because of this total participation, that new employee also should participate or should be a member of this specialization, whether hourly employee or salaried employee. Why? Because of that total disjoint, total participation. Clear, Shabab, for these rules?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, let's stop here. For the next session, inshallah, we continue with the remaining concept of an EER